Good afternoon and welcome to Bookworms. Bookworms is a 1.5 hour program that we present to you every fortnight, because the following week this will be reissued or reprogrammed or repeated is the word. I have to have my co-host in the studio today is Graham Bernard and I'm Marilyn Buzade. So over the next half hour we're going to be talking about two quite different books, but about two gentlemen. So Graham's going to start off today and he was going to be talking about a book about
David Jason.
David Jason. Tell us all about David Jason, Graham.
Thanks, Marilyn. David Jason, one of my favourite actors. He has been a star of TV and film for many, many years, of course. I love biographies. They're one of my favourite genres of book. And this particular one won the National Book Awards in England, won Biography of the Year in 2013. And I've read lots of biographies that have been written by actors and drama people, and some of them can be pretty dour. I always remember reading Kenneth Williams' book, one of the funniest men on TV, but his book was so depressing, his biography. But David Jason's is a conversation.
That's lovely.
How we see him on TV is how he writes his book.
That's lovely. Graham, I think I had the wrong microphone on when you first started, so I hope that we got the fact that it's Graham Bernard who's speaking and your first words. Would you also like to shift along a little bit to your right,
right.
That wonderful camera that lost you last time?
Oh, right. Well, you can't have that.
Oh, that's lovely. Oh, you've done the hair this time. And we're actually on the right microphone. So,
that's good.
So just going back to
that's
the first...
encouraging.
It is. So just going back, you were talking about
David Jason.
Thank you.
So he was born in 1940 in North London, and he had a wonderful childhood. Him and his brother were brought up during the war, and lots of adventures, escaping bombs, and he had wonderful parents. It's a very happy childhood, and he was a trained electrician, but he had this great desire to be on stage. And a lot of these famous actors now all started off like you and I. I mean, I was thinking coming in the car, between you and I, we've probably got 80 years of amateur dramatics between us.
Just about.
I'm being cautious there.
You're being cautious there. Excellent.
And most of these famous actors started that way, in local little theatres, cold, drafty halls, learning their lines, and horrible directors. But it was in their blood, and they kept trying and trying and trying. Not everybody succeeded. Yeah. He was one that finally did. And sometimes it's pure luck. It's just who might happen to be in the audience on the night that you do a performance.
True. Yeah. And also the fact that, David Jason doesn't look like one of your flamboyant celebrity types. I always remember someone coming to me once at Wairarapa College and saying something about one of the teachers. Oh, obviously that's the person who's into drama and everything. I said, no, you walk down Street in Marston, I could take you down there, and you'll see people who just look quite ordinary and just normal people, and they'd be the best actors or actresses in the town.
Yep. Yeah. And that's how he's conducted his life too. He's been a very ordinary person, and his friends have been lifelong friends. He was married originally to a Welsh lady called Myfanwy Telog, which I think is a lovely name.
Yes.
And she died.
Like under Milkwood, there was a Myfanwy, yeah.
Yes, that's right. And he then met somebody else, and they had a child, and he was knighted a few years ago, and he got married to his girlfriend the day before his knighthood, so that she could be Lady Jason.
Oh, how lovely.
Yes. He was born David White. And when he joined Equity, which is the Actors Union, there was already a David White registered, so he couldn't use his own name. So he said, well, I'll be David Whitehead. And they said, well, no, we've got one of them as well. And one of his favourite stories as a child was Jason and the Argonauts.
Oh,
so he said, oh, well, I'll be David Jason.
Oh, excellent.
And that's how he got
became
his name.
it. Yeah.
So he's now Sir David Jason. I want to read just a little story here, which I think is lovely, and everybody will know what I'm talking about when they hear the end of the story. There's lots of adventures that he goes through to get to where he is today. But I thought this was just quite charming, and a twist of fate, I don't know. Maybe he's lucky he didn't get this particular part. But he writes, early in 1968, I was summoned to the BBC Television Centre, the High Church, the Mecca of the TV world. To get an audience in those hallowed halls at that time, you either had to be God or one of his disciples. David Croft asked me to read for a part in a sitcom, you and I know who David Croft is, that he had co-written with an actor and a writer called Jimmy Perry, and which they were trying to get off the ground. Michael Mills, the BBC's head of comedy, was apparently very keen on the show and determined to see it made. David was perfectly upfront with me. He and Jimmy and Michael had wanted another actor for this particular role, and the actor had desperately wanted to oblige them, but he was unavailable because he had already signed up for another show, and they wanted to try me out. One morning at about 10, I went in to see David, Jimmy and Michael in a room at the BBC and read for them from the pilot script of the proposed series. It was pretty good stuff, funny and character-driven. Then I went home, where Anne, my agent, phoned me at about 12:30. "Good news," she said. "They want you for the part." I hung up. I was so excited. I was going to be in a BBC comedy series. I was going to be rubbing shoulders with the movers and the shakers. I couldn't wait to tell people, specifically my mother. I felt enormously pleased with myself. At about 3 in the afternoon, the phone rang again. It was Anne once more. "Look, I don't know how to tell you this," she said, "but I think you better sit down. I'm afraid they don't want you for that part anymore." Well, that knocked the wind right out of my sails, while at the same time removing the bottom from my world. The explanation went something like this. Apparently, David and Jimmy had gone to lunch in the BBC canteen and bumped into Bill Cotton, who famously went on to be controller of the BBC, but at this point was a producer of light entertainment shows. Cotton said he was pleased he had run into the pair of them at precisely that moment because he had spoken to this rather well-established actor, the one that Jimmy and David had originally wanted for the part that I had just read for that morning. And he'd had to tell the actor how sorry he was, but the next series of the Spike Milligan show that he had signed up for some time ago had been cancelled. But at least by way of compensation, he had Jimmy and David's show to do instead. So that was that. Jimmy and David had got their original choice for the part after all, and they didn't even know it. So David, that's David Croft, who had been put into a particularly difficult situation, had to explain the mix-up to Anne, and Anne had to explain it to me. All of which is another way of saying that for 2.5 hours I was Corporal Jones in Dad's army.
Oh, really?
Oh, well, I consoled myself after I put the phone down. It probably won't come to anything anyway.
Oh, goodness.
Now, I can't imagine anyone else but Clive doing that part.
But that's right.
For 2 hours.
Yes, he was.
David Jason was
lovely.
cool. And then he goes on to say here, he also had a lot to do with the guys who started off Monty Python. So there was Michael Palin and all those guys, Eric Idle, and they'd done a show called Do Not Adjust Your Set.
That's right, yes.
Which was based on the... remember when we first had TVs and they had to do a signal check and we'd do all those funny lines and they'd say, please do not adjust your set.
Yeah.
Then they did... we have something to make you laugh or something like that. So he worked with them for all these shows, and then when they set up Monty's Python, they dropped him. So he says here, after a few other things that happened, what an extraordinary little phase this has been. A brush with Monty Python, a brush with Dad's army. It was as though everything I'd touched turned to gold, but only after I'd stopped touching it and gone to another room. It was Clive Dunn, of course, who got the role of Corporal Jones, and what a superb job he made of it. Would I have been anywhere near as good in the role? Who knows? But also, if I had ended up in Dad's army, then I probably wouldn't have done Open All Hours, or Only Fools and Horses, or Inspector Frost, and all the other things that my career opened out to.
Because did Clive Dunn go on and do anything else apart from Jonesy?
Well, I don't think so. He recorded Grandad. Remember that song, Grandad?
Yes.
Granddad. Love that was him. But I don't think he did.
No, I
because
don't.
he was very young. They made him to look old. He was.
Oh, was he? Oh,
if
I
he's
didn't know
not
that.
still alive, he's only just recently died. He was one of the youngest in the cast, apart from Ian Lavender, who is still alive. But Clive Dunn was made to look old and dottery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was relatively young. Other things that people may not realise with David Jason, he's Mr. Toad in Wind in the Willows movie. He was Danger Mouse. He was the voice for the BFG. I think it's the Big Friendly Giant. So he's done a lot of stuff. Yeah, wonderful actor. And I really enjoy reading biographies like this that are written by the author. I'd rather read a biography than an autobiography because it's their words.
You mean the other way? An autobiography rather than a biography.
Oh, is that an autobiography?
That one.
Okay. So I'd rather read that because it's not somebody saying
someone else
he said, she said, and they did, and he did.
Yeah.
This is I said, I did. So you're getting it direct from the horse's mouth.
And did you say he had children?
He's got one daughter.
One daughter. Did she go on and do anything at all?
Don't know. I haven't read anything there about that yet. There was when he got knighted. How am I going for time? Oh, I'm okay.
No, you're fine.
When he got knighted, Ronnie Barker was invited to the investiture, but unfortunately he died between the announcement of David getting his knighthood and being invested. But he sent Ronnie sent David a poem which I want to read just to finish up, and it was lovely. Congratulations, little feed, Her Gracious Majesty decreed that Granville, little errand lad, and Delboy, Frost, and others had all served their nation passing well. So here's to Granville, Frost, and Dell. The old ex-governor's proud to see his comrade reach such high degree. Knight of the realm and TV star, who never thought he'd get this far. Arise, Sir David, she will say, the sword upon your shoulder lay. I raise a glass filled to the brim, and truly say, good night from him. And that's good night,
good from me.
K-N-I-G-H-T. Lovely. And he absolutely treasures that poem.
Oh, isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
And he's not doing anything. How old he's?
Born in 40, so he's 60, he's nearly 80, 79. And I think now, I've just heard that he is doing a new series. It's called Still Open All Hours, and he's playing the shopkeeper.
Oh, okay.
Because he inherited the shop from Arkwright.
Yes.
So he's, and I think it's called Still Open All Hours.
Yeah. So was he born in the east end of London?
Yep.
So that was all sort of natural accent and...
Yeah, that was all. Del Boy was him really, I think, down to a T. Yeah, that was him. Yeah, he was kind of playing his own. It's a lovely book. As I say, it won the Biography of the Year in 2013, so that's no mean feat.
No.
Because there's biographies coming out all the time. It's a lovely read.
Oh, is that lovely? Yes. And he... no, I was going to say not about him, but about some of those programs. There's not a lot of those sort of programs on TV anymore, is there?
You know, I was thinking last night when I was just looking through this book, it would be lovely to have a series on TV of all the good old British comedies, Open All Hours, Only Fools and Horses,
Dad's Army,
yes. All those lovely. What's that one with Mrs. Slocum?
Mrs. Bouquet. No.
Oh, yeah,
Mrs. Bouquet, yeah.
Last of the Summer Wine. Hello.
Yeah.
All those lovely, great, funny British comedies. No swear words.
I wonder why they've gone to... Why have they gone now to Love Island?
Well, yeah, it's reality shows now.
It's
they're
the
comedy shows,
isn't it?
They're the comedy shows of today, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, because they were real fixtures, weren't they? Those programs.
And they were watched by all generations too, you know. They were good, clean fun with a bit of innuendo. British are very good at innuendo, but that's harmless. Yeah.
No, they were good shows. Oh, that's interesting. Really good.
Thank you. So it's all up to you. So, you've got something very interesting to read.
Well, I've got something from someone called George Allegire. So that's George Allegire. Now, George Alagaya, when I go over to England quite often, and I would listen to the BBC News, and on the BBC News was one of the presenters was George Alagaya, and apart from having a very nice voice and a very nice manner, he was actually rather drop-dead gorgeous. So I always wanted to watch the news if George was on. And then a couple of years ago, I was over in England and I went to a women's institute evening. And on one of the tables where they have all sorts of little, things for people to buy, there was a book called A Passage to Africa by George Alagaya. It was a hardcovered book for 50p. So I thought, now I'll be able to find out something about my friend George. And at that stage, George had time off from the BBC because he had cancer. And so for a while he was not on the in the news or anything. He hadn't been on the news for quite a while. And I was talking to my sister the other day and she said, no, he's back on the news, so it'll be lovely to...
I think you might be going to see him.
I might be able to see him, yes. Anyway, this is a fascinating book about George and his family because they went to Africa in 1961. He was only about 6, and he went there with his family from Ceylon, as it was called then, and they were Tamils, and his father decided that they were going to migrate to Ghana. So they went over to Ghana and he grew up in Africa. He went to school, they sent him to boarding school in England, and then he got a job as a journalist in Africa, and then he became the correspondent in the 1980s and 90s, the BBC correspondent from Africa. And he went around so many of the countries that were, Rwanda, Liberia, South Africa, Mandela, and all the names. And he just gives such a wonderful insight into life in Africa and the way he describes what was going on and what's still going on. And so this book, I got the book over there and it was a little bit heavy to bring home, so I didn't bring it home. And then when I got home, I decided I'd ask at Headley's if they would find the book for me. And this is a new preface, and it's sort of slightly updated version with a few more bits in it. But there's still some lovely passages, and if I just read a bit from it. A Passage to Africa has been a few months in the writing, but virtually a lifetime in the making. While the events it covers reflect the preoccupations of a conventional Western newsroom, where I've worked since early 1989, my response to what I've witnessed is coloured by a much earlier experience. As a child, Africa's my home. My family moved from Ceylon, as it was then, to Ghana when I was 6. So it's primarily about Africa, but it's also about how I came to think about Africa in the way I do. I am British, that is what it says on my passport, and my home is Britain. But the deeper answer, and the honest one, is that I am more than British. I'm the sum of my experiences, and Africa is a huge element of that. I belong to Africa, or at least a piece of me does. And when they moved there in 1961, it was a time when all things seemed possible. Although we were immigrants, we were caught up in the air of optimism. It was contagious. And so because there were problems with the Tamils in Ceylon, and he knew that, his father knew that they really needed to get out from there.
It's an odd place to go. I was just trying to think, why would you go from Ceylon
to Ghana?
To Ghana.
Yeah, I think whether he got the job, I'm just trying to remember whether the father had a job there, but that was where they went. He ended up three decades later in South Africa. That was the last place he sort of worked in Africa before he was sort of basically in England with his wife and his 2 children. He says, "You might agree that I'm no different from scores of other foreign reporters who've passed their eager eyes over this continent. After all, I am a Brit, and I work for that most British of institutions, the BBC, that David Jason had his thing running with. But sometimes it's where you come from, not where you end up, that marks you out. And he goes on to sort of talking about the sense of where he started off from historically and literally. And he also... this is rather lovely what he talks about. Long ago, before I came to know and love Africa as a place, I yearned for it as an idea. It was to be for my family a place of deliverance, a promised land. From that day in May 1961, when my father announced we were to leave our island home Ceylon for the distant shores of Africa, it began to work a sort of magic on me. And he had this vision of Africa and what it would be for him and his three sisters. And he says that such optimism is shared by all who've sought refuge in a new land. A migrant does much more than move from one place to another. His journey is a journey from despair to hope, from oppression to opportunity. Of course, my parents never said we were leaving forever. Very few people leave the land of their birth saying they'll never come back. And he goes on to say, it was not Ceylon we had rejected, but what it had become, and that would change. Actually, what happened, that we ourselves changed. It was especially true of my sisters and me. From the minute we were made aware of this place called Africa and the prospects it held in store, our young minds began to look forward, not backwards. And it's really, really lovely. And when his father got there, he bought a car, and it was a Mercedes. And there's a lovely little bit here where he talks about where you'd think back about where you were when President Kennedy was shot, or when Nelson Mandela moved from one place to the other. It was released from prison, and it was his first drive, and our new car is on a par. He was only 6, and that as a momentous event. What greater proof could be for a boy of 6 of Africa's vast opportunities than to be driving through its streets in a Mercedes-Benz just days after setting foot on the continent? So it's lovely. And then, of course, he went on. He got a job in Liberia in the middle of the Civil War, and he talked about the fact that, kids, play guns and things and bang, bang, you're dead. But it was the kids who were in the armies. There were little kids who were actually fighting, and it was for real for them. So the book's got photos of his time there, and, some of the other correspondents who were there with him, and he met his wife Frances, and they had two boys, and he just met so many people, and he had the hope for the future. He's got The White Man's Burden, Mandela's Miracle, and it's just who's to blame. One of them is it was the land of milk and honey, so he talks about that too. But his insight into Africa and all the different sort of facets of the continent, and this vast continent. And he...
It's fascinating, Marilyn, that this is a family that went to Africa for the opportunities, when now people are leaving Africa for the opportunities.
Yeah.
Now, back in the 60s, Ceylon and Ghana were probably both Commonwealth countries.
Yes.
So it might have been easy
that might have been the reason. That could have been the reason.
Transition across.
Yeah. And he brings up something about the baobab trees, what we talked about with Little Prince a while ago, and how how you can get the two Africas. They're on a trip with the boys, he and his wife, and they're gone from Uganda to Zimbabwe, and the state of the roads. And he was talking about how could you ally those two sort of parts of Africa, and his wife was reading from a book about the baobabs that they were passing, and it says here that some of these trees are 4,000 years old, and one of the boys said, if only the baobabs could speak, Dad, I bet they'd know the answer to your question. And so he says the baobabs have seen all the best and the worst. They've been there for 4,000 years. They've known incredible beauty and terrifying ugliness. So today, in their gnarled and knobbly old age, perhaps they're not confused or worried about what is happening in this most blighted of continents. They've experienced the ebbs and flows of history. They understand that no condition is permanent. They know that Africa is not as fragile as she sometimes looks. Africa will change. Its people will be changed. God bless Africa. Our time will come again. That's how he ends it.
Baobab trees, they call them upside-down trees.
Yes, that's right. Those ugly-looking ones.
There's a huge one by Victoria Falls, which I visited.
Yes.
That David Livingstone lived in. It's so big, and it's got this huge big hollow part at the bottom, and he's sheltered in there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's fascinating. What a lovely book, and he's a very handsome man. I could see why you can't wait to rush off to England again. I'm sure you can see him on YouTube for nothing.
I was very disappointed at the times when he wasn't. We was off the, and they were quite worried that that he wasn't going to recover. But obviously he is back on it. But it just gives you such a picture of the 1980s and 90s particularly. It was written, the first part of it was written in 2001, right. And it was sort of looking back, but he's just got such an insight into being a correspondent, and it talks about the different correspondents who were there, and they all were in this hotel, and the different things that would happen to them, and how they meet up with some of these there was a general called General Do or Die, and it's just amazing, really.
So he went to Africa at the age of 61, so he's the same age as me, or a year older than me. So he saw the huge changes in Africa,
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he was the correspondent down there, for the BBC, before he then came up back to England and became the presenter, and he did the 6 o'clock news, and the BBC World News was often the...
I watched Gandhi last week. It's the first time I've seen it since it first came out, and because he lived in India, and it showed the terrible ways the Indians were treated in South Africa. Terrible.
Yes,
but
they were.
Obviously, the Sri Lankans going to Ghana didn't have that same.
No. So
difficulty.
It's just fascinating about, and he does talk a lot about the white. He calls it the white man's burden and things. It's a lovely book. Anyway, as usual, looks as though we've come to two great books.
Yeah,
so
lovely.
David Jason and George Alagaya, Passage to Africa. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks,
and apart from the slight hiccup at the beginning, I think at least this time...
You've got it in for me. Last time you didn't put the camera on, and
it wasn't my fault.
Microphone on.
I'm not
I'll just wait to turn
sorry.
up next time. You can do it yourself.
Anyway, it's been lovely. And this is Bookworms, and this will be repeated next week at the same time, and in a fortnight there'll be another couple of people. Won't be us, but it'll be 2 more people. So goodbye from both Graham and myself.